Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 9.3A. I've entitled this video, Faction, Friction, and Political Parties. This video is going to cover pages 256 to 258. Opposing parties. The American people generally admired President Washington and his service to the nation. Still, harsh attacks appeared from time to time in newspapers. One paper even called Washington, quote, the scourge and the misfortune of his country. Most of the attacks on Washington came from supporters of Thomas Jefferson. They hoped to weaken support for the policies of Alexander Hamilton, which the president seemed to favor. In fact, by 1796, the supporters of Jefferson and Hamilton were beginning to form the nation's first political parties. At that time, many Americans thought political parties were harmful to good government. The Constitution made no mention of parties because its authors saw no good use for them. Washington disapproved of political parties, or factions, as they were known. He warned that they would divide the nation. To others, though, it seemed natural that people would disagree about issues. They also knew that people who hold similar views tend to band together. Question number 1. While most Americans appreciated President Washington, he did face some criticism while in office. Most of the attacks came from which group of people? The supporters of Thomas Jefferson. Question 2. What were the supporters of Thomas Jefferson hoping would happen when they criticized Washington? Well, they were hoping to weaken support of the policies of Alexander Hamilton, whom the president did seem to clearly favor. Question 3. The disagreement between which two people led our country to have our first political parties? The differences between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Question number 4. Why did the United States Constitution not mention political parties? Because the people that wrote the Constitution, they didn't see any good use for political parties. Question 5. How did George Washington feel about political parties? He didn't like them. He disapproved of them. In fact, this quote on the right-hand side, you can see in his farewell address, he's basically going to say as much, that you do not want political parties in America. Question 6. What was another name for political parties back then? Factions. Question 7. What was a common argument that people used to explain why it made sense to have political parties in the United States? Well, to some people, disagreements just seem natural. That's going to happen. And because people with similar views tend to hang together, the thought was, why not give them a political party where they can be with other people who feel the same way? Washington's cabinet was clearly divided on key issues. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson had very different views. They disagreed on economic policy and foreign relations. They did not share the same opinion on the power of the federal government or on the meaning of the Constitution. Even Washington was partisan, clearly favoring one faction. The president believed he stood above politics, but he usually supported Hamilton's views. And now we're going to go over the chart, 8 through 19. You're going to fill in the chart as we go. I'll try to do this nice and slow. Here we go. Views on the issues. What type of government did he favor? Thomas Jefferson favored a strong state government. Alexander Hamilton favored a strong central or federal government. And feel free to pause the video at this time if I'm going too fast on the chart. Which European power did he favor? Jefferson favored France. Alexander Hamilton favored England or Britain. How did he feel about a national bank? Jefferson was against or opposed to a national bank. Hamilton wanted a national bank. Which Americans did he feel should control the government? Jefferson felt that the government should be controlled by ordinary Americans, the common people. Hamilton favored the government being controlled by the elite, the cream of the crop of society. How did he feel about having laws to protect the liberties of the people? Thomas Jefferson wanted liberties to be protected by law. Alexander Hamilton was opposed to having such laws. How did he feel about having the American government modeled after the English government? Thomas Jefferson believed that the American government should not be modeled on the English government, and Alexander Hamilton, as a fan of England, wanted our government to be modeled after the English government. That takes us through that chart. Except we still have another question to answer. Question 20. What does the word partisan mean? Partisan means picking a side over the other, clearly favoring a side. Question 21. While President Washington tried not to be partisan, which side did he take a majority of the time between Jefferson and Hamilton? Well, most of the time he took Alexander Hamilton's point of view. Political parties emerge. The differences found in Washington's cabinet also existed in Congress and among the public. They formed the basis for two distinct political parties that emerged at this time. One party was the Federalist. Led by Hamilton, this group favored a strong federal government. They believed the Constitution gave government implied powers. These implied powers are not enumerated or listed clearly in the Constitution. Instead, Federalists believed the enumerated powers imply the power to do other things. Federalists believed Congress could make all laws necessary and proper to carry out its enumerated powers. The Democratic Republicans, or Republicans for short, stood against the Federalists. Jefferson and Madison led this faction. They believed in a strict reading of the Constitution. They rejected the Federalist idea of implied powers. They believed congressional powers were limited to what is absolutely necessary to carry out the enumerated powers. Debate over the national bank highlighted these differences. The Constitution gave Congress specific powers to do such things as issue and borrow money. To Hamilton, this implied that the federal government could create a bank to help with these tasks. Jefferson and his people disagreed. And now we're going to answer questions 22 through 31, more of the chart. Here we go. Which political party was he the leader of? Thomas Jefferson was the leader of the Democratic Republicans, or Republicans for short. Alexander Hamilton was the leader of the Federalists. How did he feel about a strong national or federal government? Thomas Jefferson was fearful of a strong federal or national government. He did not like it. Alexander Hamilton was in favor of a strong federal government. How did he feel about how the Constitution should be interpreted? Thomas Jefferson favored a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. None of this implied wiggle room. He believed in a very firm reading of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. He believed that there were enumerated or implied powers that gave Congress a lot of wiggle room to make laws and decisions. Which people did he feel should hold public office? Thomas Jefferson believed that those common people, those everyday people, those merchants and manufacturers, landowners and investors, scratch that. He supported the plain people, farmers and tradespeople. I was reading off the wrong chart there. Yes, Thomas Jefferson favored the plain people, so to speak, the farmers and tradespeople. Alexander Hamilton, however, favored the more elite, rich people. He favored the merchants, the manufacturers, the landowners, the investors, the lawyers, and the clergy. How did he feel about the common people? Thomas Jefferson was a strong supporter of the common people. He believed that it was through these people, they were the virtuous people, they were the ones that you could trust. How did he feel about the common people and Alexander Hamilton? Alexander Hamilton was fearful of the common people. He feared they were people that were easily given to mob rule and they could be easily swayed by foolishness. The two parties also agreed about the role of ordinary citizens in government. Federalists supported representative government, in which elected officials rule in the people's name. They did not believe it was wise to let the people become too involved in politics. Federalists thought that educated, wealthier men should hold public office. They did not trust ordinary people to make good decisions. In Hamilton's words, quote, "The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right." The Republicans feared a strong central government controlled by only a few people. They believed that democracy and liberty would be safe only if ordinary people took part fully in government. As Jefferson wrote in a letter, quote, "I am not among those who fear the people. They and not the rich are our dependents for continued freedom." And on this slide, you can see a lot of the same answers that we did on the chart from the previous slide, but if you need to finish this, you can go ahead and pause the video at this time. Washington's reaction. The growing differences between the parties and between Hamilton and Jefferson troubled President Washington. He tried to get his two cabinet members to work out their differences. He wrote to Jefferson trying to persuade him, I ardently wish that some line could be marked out by which both of you could walk. Washington's efforts to get Jefferson and Hamilton to work together failed. The split was so strong that Jefferson left the cabinet and his job as Secretary of State. Soon afterward, Hamilton resigned as Secretary of the Treasury. The rival groups and their points of view moved further apart. As the election of 1796 approached, the two parties each prepared to seek control of the presidency. Question 32. How did President Washington feel about the growing differences between Hamilton and Jefferson? It troubled him. It made him sad. It made him concerned that would this government be able to make it through these stark contrasts between these two groups of people. In question 33, due to his frustration with how things were going, what did Jefferson do with his job as Secretary of State? He dropped the microphone and said, I'm out of here. He quit. He left the Secretary of State job and said, Washington, do as you will. I will be back later in this job as president. I will be replacing you at some point, and he will become our third president of the United States. Well, thank you so much for watching. Before we go, I have this fun meme. Republican, Democrat, rational human being. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.